A video about how to analyze poetry using William Blake's poem Holy Thursday. Is this a holy thing to see? Over the past week, animals have been found carrying strange messages. Literary detectives, such as myself, have been decoding these strange messages. So today, we're going to look at one of these messages that I have found. The first step in analyzing a poem is to read the poem carefully. Be sure to stop the video here so that you may read the poem. Our second step in analyzing a poem is to look at the title in the first stanza. So basically, we're just trying to further understand the poem, and we're looking at word use and just basically trying to figure out what's going on in the poem. So first, we're going to look at the title of the poem, which is Holy Thursday. Is this a holy thing to see? So Holy Thursday is a religious day. And also in the title is this a holy thing to see? Which is a rhetorical question. Okay, now let's look at the first stanza. So the first stanza also begins with, is this a holy thing to see? So again, another rhetorical question. The same one. Then Blake continues on saying, in a rich and fruitful land, implying that this land he's talking about is prosperous. And he continues on saying, babies. And these babies are being fed with a cold and usurious hand. When analyzing poetry, it's also important to pick out words that you don't really know the meaning of, and so in this case, the word usurious means of or relating to the practice of usury, or giving loans with large interest rates. So here the word usurious is used to describe the hand that's feeding these babies who are being reduced to misery in this rich and fruitful land. Step 3 of analyzing a poem. Look at the importance of the stanza you've just looked at. So in this stanza, we have this rhetorical question, is this a holy thing to see? And we're talking about babies that are reduced to misery. And they're also being fed with this cold and greedy hand, another rhetorical question. And we're essentially questioning if this supposed rich and fruitful land is even prosperous in the first place, due to the rhetorical question and the miserable babies listed below. Moving on to the next stanza, as you can see there's more rhetorical questions here, asking, is that trembling cry a song? As babes are singing, if it can be a song of joy, as they seem to be crying. He's asking, so many children poor. So there's like lots of poor children. And then there's a statement at the end, which is saying it's a land of poverty, referring back to the previous lines with the poor children. So the narrator, in talking about these poor children, is referring back to the first stanza where they talked about the babes reduced to misery. And the narrator is asking whether this trembling cry, whether it's a song, and if this supposed song can be a song of joy. And from the title, Holy Thursday, we can get that these are most likely church songs. Also, if you look in both stanzas, there's the use of the word land, which has significance. In the second stanza, it's referring back to this prosperous land, declaring that it is a land of poverty, due to the fact that there's these poor children that are trembling and crying with this questionable song, as they're being fed with cold and usurious hands. So now that we've looked at the second stanza, let's talk about the importance. So again, going back to our main focus of the poem, is this a holy thing to see, that we've established? So we're asking whether this land of poverty, which we've established is not fruitful, because there are these poor children, whether this is holy, and that these songs that they're singing, these trembling cries, asking whether it's a song, and whether these church songs can be a song of joy, as these children are living miserable lives and they're poor. So now let's look at the third stanza. So now we're going to pick out some of the significant and important stuff. So a lot of times in poetry, when you see repetition, it is very important, as it is here. And the word there refers to the children that we talked about earlier. And so these first 3 lines are describing a type of landscape. So in this landscape, there's a sun that never shines. And there are fields that are bleak and bare. And the ways are filled with thorns. And the final line says that in this landscape, it is eternal winter. So we conclude that this landscape is pretty miserable and bleak. So remembering earlier in the poem where we talked about this land of poverty these children live in. So this land of poverty is this landscape that's being talked about here, where these poor and miserable children are living. It's also important to look at words and think if they have connotations. So here the word thorns, because we were talking about the church earlier in the church songs, and also because we're talking about Holy Thursday, the thorns could be associated with Jesus. And also this eternal winter phrase refers to this kind of sad landscape, cold, and how the eternal represents that there's really no escape and that it's there for their lives. Alright, now let's look at the last stanza. So it says, wherever the sun does shine, and wherever the rain does fall. So here, there's this nice landscape, or fruitful. And if we remember, this fruitful land was mentioned in the first stanza, and this is opposing the landscape mentioned in the previous stanza that was miserable and sad. And then it says, babe can never hunger there. So it's saying that these miserable babies or children can never go to this fruitful land, and they're stuck in their miserable land. The word hunger here is a little confusing in this context, so we're going to put a question mark next to it and go back to it once we analyze the full poem. And this last sentence says, nor poverty the mind appall. And so the word appall is one of those words that you might need to look the definition up, and it means disgust. So it's saying that poverty does not disgust the mind. It's also important in poetry to ask questions. So we'd ask ourselves, why doesn't poetry discuss whoever it's talking about? And also, who are they talking about? So we would ask ourselves these questions and even ask, whose mind does poverty not disgust? So thinking about the importance a little bit now that we've looked at this, so asking this question we've been asking again and again, is this a holy thing to see? These children not being allowed in this fruitful land and stuck in their miserable and sad one mentioned in the previous stanza, and people's minds which poverty does not disgust. So we're asking, is this a holy thing to see? So right before we look at the full poem, we're going to think about the historical significance in which this poem was written. So after doing a little research, we found out that William Blake lived in England during the late 1700s, early 1800s, and at this time the Church of England was in power, and that church officials were breaking rules at the time in collecting taxes from the poor, and they initiated a Sunday school for poor children. Okay, so now we're going to look at the full poem. So we remember our underlying rhetorical question asking, is this a holy thing to see? Referring to the scenes described below. So it's asking whether the scene described below is holy. So whether this fruitful land with these miserable babies being fed with these cold and usurious hands is holy. And we established that usurious means taking money from others, and we established also that the church officials were doing this during the time this poem was written. And in the next stanza, more rhetorical questions about if this trembling cry is a song, and if this song, or church songs, which we established earlier, can be a song of joy. And we also said that these poor children are these babes reduced to misery, being fed with the cold and usurious hands now of church officials, as they're singing church songs, which sound like a trembling cry. And we also talked about the lands earlier, and we established that this statement saying that it is a land of poverty takes us out of question, saying that it is not fruitful. And we also said in the third stanza that this landscape represents the lives of the children that are miserable, bleak, and filled with suffering. And now that we've learned more historical context about the church being involved with this, the thorns plays an even larger role. And we also established that this landscape, again, referring back to the poor and miserable children. And in this last stanza, it's talking about where the sun does shine and where the rain does fall, or a fruitful landscape, unlike the one that we mentioned before. And that these babes who are miserable and in a land of poverty can never hunger there or go there. And also this hunger can refer to the fact that they are indeed hungry. Again, referring back to their misery. And we also talked about how there are these minds, and that these minds are not appalled by poverty. And we asked ourselves who these minds refer to. Okay, so now we're going to try to get the really big picture here. So William Blake, the author, we can now tell is writing about miserable, poor children in the church. So what is he trying to say? So he's asking whether or not this is a holy thing to see. The church, with their usurous hands, taking money from the poor as these babies are reduced to misery. And this is all happening in a supposedly rich and fruitful land. And at this time, industrial England was doing very well, and so were the church officials. Full land. It's a land of poverty. So now, what can we take away from the poem, knowing its historical significance and the meaning of the poem itself? It was criticizing the Church of England and saying that these church officials lived in great luxury or in fruitful lands, and that these poor people were suffering at the hands of the church, and that they were not being helped by the church. So essentially, the church was not doing their duty of helping people find religious salvation and helping people, but rather taking from people. Now, once we've found the true meaning of the poem, we can make a thesis. Thanks for helping me uncode this poem. Now you know how to analyze future poems if they're ever found again.